All right, we'll give everyone a few minutes to join.
Yeah, I should put this back here. There we go, it's a prop.
Exactly, I have mine too. All right, I will go ahead and start. Welcome everyone to the Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law at Stanford University. I'm Dee Kuo, the Associate Director for Research, and I thank you for joining us today. Today, we're delighted to have Stephanie Mudge speak with us. She is the Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of California, Davis. She works on neoliberalism, the sociology of political parties, and technocratic expertise, and is co-editor of the Cambridge Studies in Historical Sociology book series. Her book, Leftism Reinvented, Western Parties from Socialism to Neoliberalism, was published by Harvard University Press in 2018 and is one of my favorite books of the past few years. Read it if you can. Today, she will be presenting new research on the rise of strategists. If you have any questions during her talk, please type them into the Q&A box. At this point, you know the drill. For CDDRL colleagues, if you're interested in asking your question yourself, please also indicate that in the question that you type. So now, without further ado, Stephanie.
Right, hi, thank you so much for having me here. I'm really pleased to be here. Thanks for the kind introduction. The title of my talk is Refraction and the Rise of the Strategist, and it's sort of what I'm going to present today. It sort of bridges my book, Leftism Reinvented, some of the arguments from the book with a new project that's very much in the making still. So I'm especially pleased to have the opportunity to present on it and get some feedback. Right, so with no further ado, this is what I'm going to talk about today. There's basically four components to what I'm going to talk about today. The first is a very general introduction to what I'm characterizing as the dominant story on the rise of the strategist. So there's no shortage of literature, especially in political science, on consultancies and pollsters and political advisors and strategic experts. And so I'll sort of characterize what I understand to be the dominant story on the rise of the strategist in existing literature. And then I'm going to make some arguments about how we might rethink the dominant story in a more, with emphasis on taking a more deeply historical perspective. And then in the third part of the talk, I'll get into matters of explanation. And really what I'm going to do is present a hypothesis that emerges out of my book about what the sort of correlates or conditions are of a strategic turn in politics. And I characterize this hypothesis as the Pilanian Hypothesis in honor of Mr. Karl Polanyi. And then I'll make some concluding comments, and I'll look forward to any questions or comments that you have. So that is the plan. So let me start with talking about a little bit about the sort of dominant story on the rise of the strategist. So what you're seeing here is a graph that I put together that takes sort of a preliminary effort to map out references to figures who are associated with strategist or strategic expertise in politics. So terms like spin doctor or political consultant or campaign strategist or political strategist, you can see there in the source notes the different terms that I searched for. So this is a search, exploratory search on ProQuest historical newspapers, magazines, periodicals from the whole period from 1850 to 2019. And so what you see here is a very much a late 20th century story, right? Where these terms, the figure of the consultant or the campaign strategist, the political strategist, references to these kinds of figures in discourse in media anyway, really takes off in what some characterize as the neoliberal period, the period from 1970s forward, especially the 1990s, in the last decade of the 20th century. So this, of course, has been duly noted by all sorts of people, including especially political scientists. And the political science story is very much, for obvious reasons here, is very much a 20th century story or a late 20th century story. And so here I have a quote from Adam Scheingate from his book on political consultancy. Is called Building a Business of Politics, where he says in the last 100 years, a modern political consulting industry took shape and took control of American elections. So this raises all kinds of concerns. Of course, there's lots of reasons why social scientists and historians and folks of all stripes are concerned about the rise of consulting and the rise of strategists and strategic expertise in American politics. And so I'll just outline a few of those concerns that you find in the existing literature on the subject. And I just want to note here that I've chosen these images of the 2016 Republican primary debate on the left, and the brighter image is the more recent Democratic primary debate, one in June 2019, because I think it actually captures some of the concerns pretty well. One of those concerns being that you get politics is sort of more about theater, right? So the aesthetics of the debates in these cases, it looks a lot like a game show, and I think it captures pretty much some of the sources of concern about the consequences of a turn to strategy in politics. So more specifically, the worries include, and this goes all the way back to a literature that started to emerge, especially in political science in the 1980s, that the rise of consultants threatens citizen, voter, and candidate-driven participatory democracy. There's also a variety of works that come from both political science and from sociology, where you get concerns about professionalized politics being more about symbolism and theater, and not so much about policies, accountability, or indeed responsiveness to constituencies' demands. And what you get as a sort of correlate of that is a rise of alienation, cynicism, apathy, and what has been characterized by Caroline Lee, Michael McQuarrie, and Ed Walker as a democratization of inequality. And that's linked especially to a concern about the rise of consultancies being linked to the rise of business and corporate power in American politics. And so another worry is more about the rise of consultancies, or the rise of strategic expertise in politics says about the sort of health of American parties. And so this goes back to Blumenthal's 1982 argument about the decline of party organizations, right? So in this line of thinking, it's not so much about what the rise of strategists or the rise of consultancies do to politics. It's more that it's a symptom of something deeper, which is the decay and decline of party organization in the US. So these are all important concerns. They're concerns that I share. But I want to rethink my aim. Some of what I want to talk about today is about rethinking the dominant story, not so much in terms of the concerns that the rise of strategists and consultancies raise, but in terms of the sort of historical perspective on the rise of strategists, and in particular the consistent sort of characterization of the rise of strategists as a specifically late 20th century phenomenon. Okay, so here I'm going to get to the second part of the talk, which is centered on rethinking the dominant story. So here I'm going to make some arguments and present some evidence about why we might need to push the story back into a more deeply historical direction. And the basic argument here that I'm going to make is that, of course, strategy is not new to politics. It's not as if strategic concerns, strategic priorities emerged in political competition or in party competition spontaneously in the late 20th century. It's a long-standing, durable concern in any kind of for any kind of political party, or indeed in politics writ large. So if we take a different approach, if we move away from focusing on the 20th century and we look back more deeply, one of the simplest things you can do, of course, if you want to see if there are earlier references to pretty much anything, is take a quick look at Google Ngrams. So if you look for the same kinds of terms that I searched for in ProQuest historical newspaper, terms like political consultant and spin doctor and political strategist and campaign strategist, you get a similar story as what I've characterized as the dominant story. It's a late 20th century story here, but there's something else that's going on, right, in this earlier period. It's not something that's isolated to the late 20th century. And we could also look at distinctive historical events, for instance, the establishment of the first campaign consulting company, Campaigns Inc. in California in 1933. Tells us that there was something going on in the 1930s as well. In that particular case, it was especially in response to the gubernatorial candidacy of Upton Sinclair. Any of you who have recently watched the movie Mank know a little bit about this. It's what it's all about. And we can even go back earlier, right? We could go back even all the way to 1852. And here, what we might find is that you don't find, of course, references to political consultancies. The profession doesn't really come into existence until after the 1930s and really becomes an established professionalized institution from the 1960s forward. But we can go back even earlier, and what you find is that there's lots of references to different kinds of candidates, politicians, or people in party networks or sort of characterizations of them as strategically oriented figures. So as by way of example, in the American Whig Review in 1852, in the wake of the election of Franklin Pierce, the Democratic candidate Franklin Pierce, the American Whig Review says this in the wake of that election: it appears that presidents are no longer elected by the people for their personal merits and executive talent, but because they're supposed to represent nothing in particular. 2/3 of the American people have appointed a gentleman who has held hitherto only a respectable position as a lawyer and political strategist. So we could take this back. So the point here, one of the points here that I'm trying to make in the line of rethinking the dominant story is that the term political strategist hasn't always referred to a particular kind of professional, a particular kind of person, or a standalone set of organizations, right, or an autonomous kind of world of consultancies. It's a category that also had meaning in earlier periods, but is more a way of characterizing the orientations of politics or politicians, especially in periods of polarization, in which the period before, during, and after Civil War, of course, very much was. And so the point here is that there's a deeper historical story to tell about the turn to strategy or the determinants of turns to strategy in political life that goes well back prior to the 20th century. If we want to go really deep, we could go all the way back to Machiavelli. When you're talking about strategy and politics, I feel like it's obligatory to make some kind of reference to Machiavelli. So here I have a quote from him. The first opinion that's formed of the ruler's intelligence is based on the quality of the men he has around him. When they're competent and loyal, he can always be considered wise. When they're otherwise, the prince is open to criticism. As for how a prince can assess his minister, that here is an infallible guide. When you see a minister thinking more of himself than of you and seeking his own profit in everything he does, such one will never be a good minister and you will never be able to trust him. So one way of thinking about what Machiavelli is talking about here, if we substitute the term strategist or consultant for minister, right, is that there's this kind of complicated, tension-laden relationship between politics and expertise, or between politicians or office-holding elites and their expert advisors, right? So in this passage, Machiavelli hints at the complexity of the political expert relationship, right? On the one hand, experts communicate important things about the competence of rulers to be. On the other hand, they're a threat to the ruler's authority, right? So in other words, power seeking and truth claiming are yoked to each other in an interdependent but fragile alliance, right? So all of this sets up my arguments about rethinking the dominant story, which is that maybe we should think about parties in a more deeply historical and relational way if we want to think, if we want to understand better the rise of strategists in terms of both their causes and their effects. So here I'm going to make reference a little bit to my book, in which I lay out a particular conception of political parties that's kind of one part Gramsci and one part Pierre Bourdieu. From Gramsci, what I take is this idea that parties have these three kind of principal elements, right? Three kinds of figures, right? You get the power seekers, right? And these would be the sort of power or office seeking element of a political party. We might consider the more kind of strategic element of any kind of party network. We get the truth claimers, right? Gramsci is concerned with intellectuals, concerned especially with organic intellectuals, is very much about these sort of intermediary figures, who do the work of kind of linking represented groups to party leadership. And then the third element here is those who are this orientation toward representation or vote seeking, right? People who are kind of more connected to what we might now call the grassroots, right? So what I do in the book with this kind of tripartite way of thinking about parties is instead of thinking in terms of categories of actors or kinds of people that you find in parties or party networks, is to think of these as three sort of competing, irreducible orientations in any kind of party network. In other words, you can have actors in party networks have to in some way orient themselves toward these three kinds of concerns, right? And some actors in party networks are known more as strategic figures, right? Power or office-seeking figures, right? And some actors in party networks are known for are kind of recognized as intellectuals, as party intellectuals, or what I call in the book party experts, who may be politicians, who may be connected to social movements, they may be many other things, but their sort of basis of recognition as party networks is on the basis of their claims to expertise, right? So in other words, you can have, my way of thinking about parties here is to take Gramsci's tripartite conception of the sort of components of a party, and instead of treating them as people or groups, treating them as actor orientations, right? Things that people in party networks may be more or less oriented toward, right? And so this is grounded in a sort of field conception of political parties. This is where the refraction metaphor comes from, right? Where I argue that parties are better thought of as prisms rather than pinballs. And this all what's very complex. This is just a heuristic, right, of a prism. And the argument here is that instead of thinking about parties as organizations that are either kind of driven by what electorates want or that drive electorates, that we might think about parties instead as these sort of refractive institutions that have complex internal contested networks, right? And so the argument here is relatively simple, and I would argue even sort of common sense, but it does run counter to the sort of organizational perspective and sort of top-down, bottom-up perspective you often get in research on political parties, right? And the argument here is that we should recognize that there are these refractive processes inside parties, right? There are things that happen in the world, there are events, there are dynamics that happen in the world that are perceived inside party networks, but party networks themselves are fields of contestation, right? And people in them are variably oriented toward these three things, these three priorities or stakes of the political game that I identified in the previous slide, right? Those networks, the people in those networks are variably oriented toward power seeking, truth claiming, and or representation. And what you get in the contestation is processes are well-known sort of processes of factional competition, right? Where out of that dominant party actors acquire the ability, the authority to define what is important, what it means, and what to do about it from the perspective of the party. And it's very difficult to understand what parties end up actually saying and doing if you don't have some sense of what's going on inside these contested networks. So this is a more sort of historical and relational conception of the party than you find in some literature on political parties. And what I want to do in this new project, Strategy and Democracy, is try and build on this way of thinking about parties in order to think in a more deeply historical way about the rise of strategy and strategic experts in political life. So the way that I'm going to do this, and I'm hesitating a little because the next slide I'm going to show you is just a very preliminary thing, because this project, as I just said, is just getting off the ground. And so if we think about these priorities of parties, including strategic priorities as one of several kinds of orientations, right, then it becomes difficult then to analyze the rise of strategists in terms of the rise of organizations like consultancies or the rise of professionals like consultants, right? Because as we've seen, that doesn't necessarily travel back to earlier periods prior to those kinds of institutions, when it's not necessarily the case, of course, that somehow strategic concerns were absent. Right. So one way of doing this, of trying to get at this question of treating strategy as an orientation rather than a sort of category or a type of professional, is to look at political language in a way that's sensitive to the way that political language changes over time. Right. And so this is what I'm trying to do in sort of one part of this new project, Strategy and Democracy. What you're looking at here is on the left side is a table, a sort of preliminary exploration of terms that tend to be associated with references to strategy or strategic kinds of things or strategists in articles, especially historical articles, especially on political topics, in the Library of Congress's Chronicling America archive, which is a collection of digitized local and regional newspapers. that in this sort of subset of the collection ranges from 1836 to 1922. And what you can see here, and I've excluded references to military things because obviously you find references to strategy and all kinds of military and foreign policy related articles. So trying to exclude that, but including articles that reference political kinds of things, so the term political or the term politician. What you find is a pretty consistent set of terms that are associated with strategy, right? Terms like astute, tricky, shrewd, crafty, right? These are things that you find. And so one way of dealing with this problem of sort of conflating the term to strategy with the rise of political consultants or sort of historically specific kinds of professionals is to try and trap language in political discourse linked to strategist and strategy and strategic concerns, right? And so this gives you, going back to Google Ungram, gives you an idea of what you get when you start trying to look for these kinds of terms, right? And what you find is a term like shrewd, for instance, seems to have been a particularly strongly associated term with strategy, right? In the Chronicling America archive and in the Google Ungram book collection, that also becomes a really prominent term in the period immediately before, during, and just after in the Reconstruction period of the Civil War, right? So this is just sort of indicative of what this kind of approach might get you, and it's supposed to also give you a sense of why it is that I'm turning to that. One of the tools I want to use is a sort of computational approach focused on political language and historical newspapers. And it raises questions, right? This raises questions. Maybe if we move into the periodization, maybe if we move into the early 1900s, right? Maybe when we're dealing with more sort of progressive era politics, there's a new vocabulary that emerges around politics and matter of political strategy, right? Maybe this term shrewd is something that's especially closely associated with matters of strategy or concerns with strategic orientations in politics in the Civil War period, just before and just after. This is one of the things that I want to explore, but it gives you a sense of how I plan to go about doing that. So the summary argument here is that the dominant story, my argument here is not so much the dominant story that you get in the literature on consultancies and political strategy is wrong. It's that it doesn't sort of account for, it's not capable because of its focus on certain kinds of professionals or organizations. It's not really capable of doing a deeper historical analysis of the dynamics of the rise of strategy or strategic concerns in political life. And that is what I'm going to try to address in this project. So the last thing that I'm going to talk about here before I wrap up gets more into an argument that emerges out of my book. So I've talked about the sort of dominant story of the rise of strategists. I've talked about how we might rethink and more deeply historicize that dominant strategy. I've talked about how methodologically we might get at strategy or the rise of strategists in political life in a more historically sensitive way. And then there's, of course, the question of explanation. How do we explain strategic turns in a political life? So this is what I'll address in this final part of this brief talk. And this is going to be a bit of a challenge because what I'm going to try to do is summarize some of the cheap arguments that I develop in my book, which is 500 pages long. So it's going to be a little bit of a challenge. So you're going to have to bear with me. And of course, I'll invite any questions at the end. So one of the arguments that emerges out of my book, which is focused on shifts in the sort of dominant language and logic of left politics in the US, the UK, Sweden, and Germany over the course of the 20th century, one of the arguments that sort of emerges out of it is what I call a Pilanian hypothesis. And that hypothesis is that there's sort of a relationship that when you look inside party networks over the course of the 20th century, that there seems to be a relationship that becomes especially clear in the late 20th century between market politics, or what's sometimes called neoliberal politics, or what I sometimes call a turn to the representation of markets, the interests of markets as opposed to constituencies. So there seems to be a relationship between that and a strategic turn inside party networks and in party politics. So I call this a Pilanian hypothesis, and what I want to do is lay this out a little bit because it's one of the hypotheses that I want to continue to explore in my new project. So this is an image from my book. It first appeared in an article I published in Social Science History in 2011. And what I did here was a sort of just initial analysis of the sort of turn to market-centered policies and politics and party programs. So this shows you, it's a sort of it's made as a content analysis using the manifestos data sets of language, policy language, and party manifestos in 22 OECD countries. I've limited it here to parties of the center left and the center right. And I've used, those of you who are familiar with the welfare states literature, I've used these kind of groupings of countries according to Esping Anderson's typology of Anglo-liberal, conservative, Nordic, and Southern. And so what I do with this is, I call this a Neoliberalism Index. What I do with this is I try and kind of trace a turn, a sort of programmatic turn toward market-centered, language market-centered policies, things like free trade and deregulation and privatization and liberalization and all those things that we associate with the neoliberal turn. So I try to trace sort of emphases on these kinds of terms and also sort of discount or also sort of a turn away, I should say, from more welfareist, protective kinds of policies like Social Security and unemployment insurance and things like that in the language of party programs over the whole course of the 20th century. So that's what these two graphs show. So I have a standardized index where anything above the zero line is sort of on balance a more quote unquote neoliberal kind of emphasis, and anything below the zero line is a more kind of welfarist or state-oriented or maybe Keynesian kind of emphasis in party programs. So let me say that I fully recognize that there's a sort of a historicism here, because obviously neoliberalism becomes something very different in the later 20th century. It means something very different than it does in earlier periods. So I recognize that. That aside, what I show, or what I try to show, is that really the big historical shift in the late 20th century toward sort of market-centered politics, or what I call the neoliberalization of party programs, the really striking shift isn't so much on the center-right, where in a historical way we could say that center-right parties have always been sort of neoliberal. And what I argue here is that what you get that's a really sort of striking historical change is a sort of neoliberal turn to left, right? But even in places where you don't really expect it, like in Sweden and Denmark and places like that. So that sets up, that's a sort of setup for a motivation of the book, right? And then I try to take this sort of fielded conception of parties in order to think about, well, how do we analyze this? How do we understand this, right? In a way that isn't just sort of a blanket characterization of left parties as having sort of abandoned their social democratic principles or something like that. And so in the book, I use this fielded conception of parties as a way of trying to kind of enter into the question of why you get this kind of shift through an analysis of what's going on inside those contested party networks that I was talking about. And the figures that I focus on inside parties in the book is this figure I call the party expert, who again can be a politician, can be an office holding politician, can be someone who's seeking office, can be someone who isn't actually an office seeker, is just an advisor, right? The important thing is sort of role they play and the orientation that they have inside party networks. And then the story, and this is where it's going to get difficult for me to summarize in a couple of minutes, the whole argument of the book. But what I do in the book is I try to sort of characterize dominant party experts at different periods of time inside left parties in 4 countries, with the acknowledgement that the Democratic Party isn't really a left party in conventional sense. And the argument that I make about the sort of dominant experts that you find inside left party networks when you get to the 1990s is, unlike these earlier figures, so I'm happy to talk about if you have questions later on, the socialist theoretician who's dominant figure in the 20s, the Keynesian economist theoretician who's a dominant figure in the 60s and kind of has this hybrid orientation toward navigating matters of political strategy and also informing politics with scientific insights. What you get in the 1990s are this sort of triumvirate or trilogy of experts who are dominant in left party networks. And I'm going to emphasize 2 of them. One is a figure I characterize as a TFE. It's a sort of particular kind of economist who sees the world in terms of markets. TFE stands for transnationalized, finance-oriented economist, and the familiar figure of the strategist, right? And what I argue in the book is that there seems to be an elective affinity between the rise of the TFE, or the rise of more generally a sort of market way of thinking in left party networks, and a turn to spin. Right, so these 3 different kinds of experts, they kind of have different orientations, right? They have different kind of modes of contribution to discussions inside parties. On the one hand, TFEs thought in terms of promoting and preserving markets. In the American case, I talk about people like Larry Summers, Robert Rubin, right? On the other hand, you have strategists, right? Or what came to be termed spin doctors, who are focused on the problem of winning election. What I argue in the book is that there seems to be sort of an affinity between these two things, right? In other words, especially in left party networks, the more you get market-centered politics, like austerity, right? Policies like austerity that are a tough sell for center-left parties that don't seem to sort of be capable of addressing the needs and concerns of traditional left constituencies, right? The more left parties turn to think of the world in this way and advocate these kinds of market-centered policies, the more they need strategists or spin doctors who can help them win elections by spinning otherwise unpopular messages, right? And so one of the arguments that emerges out of this is an account of the rise of strategists that's been long acknowledged by political scientists as not just something that's sort of internal to parties or party organizations, and isn't just about sort of organizational party decline, that there's sort of a political economy story here, right? There's a relationship between a turn to strategy and a turn to markets, right? And this is something that also has a deeper historical lineage. This, of course, the 90s was not the only time, if you read Polanyi, was not the only time when we found a market-centered politics. This is exactly how Polanyi characterizes turn of the 20th century politics, right? In which he characterized a time where the self-regulated market becomes the faith of the age, right? The essentiality of the gold standard to the functioning of the international economic system was the one and only tenet common to men of all nations and all classes, religious dominations, and social philosophies, right? So in other words, there's an earlier period around the turn of the 20th century, maybe extending up through the 1920s, right? And I write about this in my book as well, when you get a kind of, it comes in a different form, but another version of sort of market-centered politics, right? And so this is interesting for the perspective of my new project, because one of the things that I want to do is evaluate this claim, this sort of hypothesis that emerges out of my book, that there's a relationship between a turn to strategy and turn to markets in a more deeply historical way, and in the new project focused mainly on the United States. So that is more or less what I have to say. I have a few concluding comments. Just to sort of wrap things up, right? So the first is sort of a summary comment, right? That dominant accounts with the rise of the strategists seem to mistake a recurrent event for a historical novelty. The Strategy and Democracy project, my new project, my aim is to use historical, computational, organizational, biographical analysis to better understand the dynamics, causes, and consequences of strategic terms in American politics. I also aim to evaluate the Pilanian hypothesis that I just laid out, that market politics and strategic terms go hand in hand. And the last point is that the project, as I've said, is very much in development, and comments are most welcome. Thanks very much.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Stephanie, for that incredible presentation, this really exciting project. So to the audience, if you have any questions, please enter them into the Q&A box, and we'll be sure to get to them. We have plenty of time. So as someone who read and really enjoyed Leftism Reinvented, I think that the role of the strategist, you're definitely right, has become more prominent and more critical to what political parties do. I was wondering if you could say something about changing campaign technologies, particularly over time. So obviously, as the population has grown, it's harder for politicians to go, from town to town on a horse and carriage, talking to voters directly. So now they have really detailed ways of reaching the electorate through slicing and dicing and micro-targeting and communications technology that makes it really easy to say exactly what you want to very specific groups of voters. How do you think that that has changed over time? Or do you think that there's probably a relationship between technological change and the need for spin doctors?
Right. So I'm really glad you asked that, because it's one of the many things that I'd like to explore as part of this project. I mean, I think the role of technology, again, it matters how you define technology. In the 19th century, the rise of print media, and the circulation, this you could understand this is, it's certainly technologically connected, in a new forms of communication that had dramatic political effects, especially in the gold standard period. So this is something, this sort of relationship between the turn to strategy and the forms that takes, of course, must be deeply connected to available technologies, right? And it must be deeply connected to the kinds of information and the access to information that politicians or office seekers or parties have. So this is something that I hope to also be able to kind of explore, right, in a more deeply historical way, and I hope in a way that might allow us to kind of think more historically about the sort of current controversies over data-driven, analytical politics. In other words, so on the thing about like information and micro-targeting, one of the things that I think is sometimes forgotten, at least I sometimes, attend events where there's lots of people in politics or who are involved in kind of data-driven campaigning. And one of the things that I think is sometimes underestimated is the extent to which that kind of targeting doesn't so much accurately characterize people as greed, alienation, and suspicion, right? In other words, voters are aware, right, that these kinds of techniques are being used, and I think they probably are directly related to a decline in trust. And so, but I think that there's always been a sort of tense relationship, right, between politicians. Politicians always have a difficulty with sort of performing authenticity, right? This is always a challenge for them, right? Because everyone knows that they want to win, and so that's not a new thing. And the effort to sort of inside parties and party networks to be able to sort of characterize what voters want and who voters are and what will appeal to them, right? This is an eternal set of concerns, right? The extent to which they can address that kind of those kinds of concerns using new technologies is incredibly important and can be transformative, but I don't think that's a new phenomenon either. So it is something that I want to kind of incorporate into the project, but maybe in a more deeply historical way with maybe a slightly broader consumption of technology than is commonly characteristic of its common usage.
Right. And I guess a related question is the historical period under consideration also involves a lot of periods of democratization when the electorate expanded and changed a lot, like the expansion of votes to women and then the end of Jim Crow. How do you think that affected party strategies and the need to develop potentially different mobilization strategies with different kinds of suffrage expansion?
Right. So one of the things that interests me about that is that democratization or the expansion of suffrage has often, especially, well, not only in the American case, but especially in the American case in ways related to the history of race, has usually come alongside what we're seeing right now, which is also struggles to disenfranchise or selectively disenfranchise, right? So democratization is sort of one, it's in a dynamic relationship with with efforts to selectively suppress, right, or disenfranchise. And so I think that's going to be an important part of the periodization question that I mentioned earlier, right? As sort of being able to as part of the periodizing, my periodizing effort back to the sort of mid 19th century, to kind of characterize both, who was enfranchised, who had access to vote, what were the politics around democratization, which gets us immediately into questions of race and immigration and all these other things, right? And then on the other hand, keeping in mind that those kind of pushes always have this flip side of trying to selectively repress or demobilize groups, right, depending on the priorities of the parties or the politicians involved. So in other words, I think it's in the same way technology is an important kind of it's important kind of to characterize and understand available political technologies or communication technologies, right, in these different historical periods. I think also this sort of phases of democratization and selective repression, right, will also be an important aspect in terms of sort of periodizing periods or parts of the historical analysis for this project. And one of the things I didn't mention before is that one of the things I hope this project will get me more deeply into is something that I wasn't really able to get into more deeply in the book, which is the dynamic relationship between questions of politics, political strategy, and race, and racial oppression and racial exclusion.
Yeah, absolutely. That's central. Okay, that's great. So we have a question here about figure two. I'm not sure if you can go back, but the question is that there's an interesting decay in a lot of the terms that you were mapping
Mhm.
more recently. What do you think explains that? Or do you think that this fits into part of your larger story, like this decline in sort of the 21st century that we see?
Um, you know, I guess I'm hesitant to answer that because engrams are handy, but it's hard to know what's in there.
Right.
And so I wouldn't want to place too much significance. The reason that I show this at all is because it's consistent with a political science story about the rise of strategists, and it's consistent with my own search of historical newspapers and things like that. And so it kind of makes sense. So I guess my first question, is whether that's really a meaningful decline, which I'm not sure I'd be willing to bet on. It's something worth exploring. And if it is a meaningful decline, I mean, we can always, come up with explanations for things, even if we're not sure it's a meaningful underlying trend. But if it is a meaningful underlying trend, then I think that the way that the period, especially around in the lead up to and since the Obama election, shifted the language of American politics in a way that was actually much more about sort of movements and interests, and that maybe involves sort of more of a skepticism, at least in certain sort of progressive political networks that I'm familiar with, a skepticism of consultants and spin doctors, or sort of politicization of the figure. I think there was a shift in the sort of valence of political consultants and spin doctors, and also in salience, which would go against the argument that this is a meaningful trend, right, where they become more politicized, than they once were. So so I hope that answers the question.
Yes, thank you. So another question here is, has your research examined any political party-centered democracy promotion programs in the developing world, like whether or not strategic planning is an element in training programs that international organizations might use to promote democracy? The implications would be interesting because of the connections possibly between the market-centered politics in the West and more use of strategy.
Well, it's a really interesting set of questions. I'm not sure it's something that that I'll be able to pursue in the project, which is already pretty ambitious. But there is an interesting thing about the rise of this sort of professionalized political consultancies. Based on my reading on the literature, my understanding is that it really is an American profession. And one of the things that happens starting especially in the 1990s, but maybe even going back into the 1980s, is a sort of export of this particular kind of professional, right? So for instance, in my book, I talk a little bit about sort of borrowing and hiring of American spin doctors in Swedish elections in the early 2000s. And I think also the late 90s, actually. So there's a sort of, there's a transnational story dimension to the story of the rise of the strategist, where it becomes sort of one of many sort of American professional exports. The cases where I know the most about that, because it's where my research is centered, is other than the US, has been Western Europe. But I wouldn't be, it stands to reason that the export is more cross-national, especially to the extent in the third wave period, there was a sort of like transnational progressive political class that emerged, connected to people like Tony Blair and Bill Clinton, that extended to South Africa, that extended to various Latin American countries. So there's no reason to think that these dynamics would necessarily be different or unique in those cases. And it would be a really interesting thing to sort of examine whether this dynamic, and this is why I'm interested in this Pilanian hypothesis actually, is because it stands to reason that this might be a sort of general dynamic, right? That the more you get parties who aren't sort of responsive or speaking for the interests of constituencies, especially, the 90s is a period I know especially well, where you get parties that are saying, we know you'd like this, but we can't do it because the markets won't want it, right? If markets won't be happy. Right, that of course parties then, if they still want to win elections, they're going to have to find ways to spin those messages. So I think theoretically there's no reason to think that this dynamic, if my Pilanian hypothesis is true, wouldn't apply in pretty much any case.
Right. So there's an interesting question here about the rise of populist leaders, or just sort of extreme figures or radical figures like Donald Trump, who are sort of a party. You know, they don't come up through a traditional party, and they certainly don't seem to rely on the advice of strategists. So even though there's definitely sort of a functional relationship between strategists and electability concerns, how do you think about these politicians, especially on just the far right across Western Europe as well, who have been able to do well seemingly by defying political conventions?
Right. I mean, well, so everyone has an explanation for populism, and everyone has an explanation for Donald Trump. So, and so I think the story on that is, I think that's a question people are going to be asking for a long time. But I brought this slide back up because I do think that there's this, and this relates actually to what I was saying earlier about voters knowing that they're being targeted, right? Which is that this sort of emergence of an internally referential political world where politics appears as theater, right? And so when you look at political debates now, at presidential debates, right, not only does it have the aesthetics of a game show, but who is to interpret after, who won the debate and who won the debate. Well, there's the campaigns, you know, the campaign strategist for the Warren campaign, and there's a campaign strategist for the Clinton campaign, and they tell you how great their candidates did, and it all kind of, you know, is presented to voters and to audiences as this sort of internally referential political theater to which they have no meaningful entry or access, and their interpretations don't really matter. They aren't of any particular concern, except insofar as you get like polls about who won the debate or whatever. And so I guess this is a long way of answering the question, but the question of sort of a turn to populism, you know, there are many things that drive a return to populism. But one of them, it seems to me, is this sort of appearance of politics as theater, right? As a closed arena, right? That isn't really meant to be about representing the interests of groups or the concerns of constituencies. And I do think that gets expressed in political language, right? The extent to which the sort of acceptable terms in mainstream politics are so limited. And then you get someone like Donald Trump who just says whatever comes into his head, right? And says all kinds of things that break all the rules, right? And in a world of political theater, there's a certain sort of, I really think there's a certain sort of cathartic release connected to that kind of performance, you know, where somebody kind of breaks the rules of a democratic arena that seems to be weirdly non-responsive to what's going on in people's lives. This is in no way, you know, an expression of admiration for the former president, but I do think that there's a connection there, right? This sort of frustration, right? That literature on the rise of professionalized politics identifies this alienation, cynicism, apathy, right? That this sets the stage for a democratic or for a populist, charismatic personality, right?
Right. So we have another question here about partisanship from Nate Grubman, one of our postdocs. Do you think about all of the mainstream parties? I know you talk about the center left or the social democratic parties in your book, but for this project, is it going to be strategists on both the right and the left? Because at least in the, you know, common parlance, the right is organized in a certain way with respect to its strategists and its funding, and the left is organized somewhat differently. Do you think that strategists play a similar role across parties?
Yes. So the first thing I'll say is that the reason I focus especially on center-left parties in my book is because of the historical claims they make to representing, and regardless of the veracity of the claims, the historical claims they make to representing the disempowered, right, the poor, the working class, the excluded, the marginalized, right? And so that was my sort of rationale for focusing on center-left parties in the book. One of the things that I also talk about in the book is the fact that the sort of right-left axis isn't really operational. It's not very meaningful in the American context until FDR comes along, right? So I do a little analysis in the book where I look at historical newspapers and I look at presidential documents from the archive at UCSB, at UC Santa Barbara. And I show that when there's a reference to right and left, oftentimes it has to do with boxing or sports or military strategy, right, or actual positions in physical space. In other words, the right-left axis isn't really a meaningful axis of sort of political understandings of the sort of political party spectrum in the U.S. until the New Deal period and thereafter, when it does become a more sort of effective way of categorizing American political life that has affinities with the sort of left-right axis in the European cases. So, which is all to say, the short answer to your question is, I don't plan to focus. This is really more about entering the analysis of politics through sort of the category of the strategist and the emphasis in the strategists and the sort of ways, the language around strategists and strategic concerns of political life across the party spectrum, right? And with this goes back again to the question of periodizing, with a sensitivity to the fact that that axis has shifted, right? The axis between the parties has shifted dramatically. You know, what the Democratic Party stands for now is nothing like what the Democratic Party stood for in the 19th century, right? So I don't have, unlike my book, I feel like I don't really have a rationale for focusing on one party or one side or the other. So I intend to take a pretty more holistic perspective that runs across the party spectrum.
Okay, so there's a question about, I guess, challenges to markets. So we obviously were in a period, we continue to be in a period of sort of neoliberal economic policy, but then there are some issues like climate change that will inevitably need to be addressed, or even just some challenges to neoliberalism, some pushback from the political left in at least some places. Whether or not it's effective is sort of a different matter. But do you think that this affects the possibilities of strategists and their ongoing importance if parties can become more responsive, if they become sort of less committed to prioritizing markets? I'm not sure if you're at all optimistic about that as a possibility, but would it affect the role of strategists?
I think, I mean, if my hypothesis is correct, then yes, it should, right? So, the hypothesis turns on the argument that on a certain way of thinking about the sort of place of the market in political discourse, right? Which is basically that it's a sort of like the economy. It's both a reality, but it's also a sort of constructed reality, right? There are certain ways of thinking about it, and ways of thinking about it have changed over time. The economy in the mid 20th century in the US in the early post-war period was understood as a sort of like engine-like thing that could be managed in a way that's responsive to the demands of constituents, right? And that's very different than an imagination of the market that you get at the turn of the 21st century, which is that it's like this thing out there, right, to which we all have to, before which we all have to bow. And so to the extent, the argument I make in the book is that, to the extent that politicians really do think in this way, then it means that constituents can knock on their doors all they want and say, hey, I'm broke and I'm working 2 jobs and that, and I can't pay for childcare, and they can say that, and the politicians can say, sorry, we don't have the money, right? We can't spend, but meanwhile we have plenty of money to like bail out the Mexican peso or whatever, right? And so this way of thinking, I think, has a real, even for people who for politicians who might understand themselves to be, they may understand themselves to be sort of progressive politicians who are responsive to their constituencies, but this way of thinking tends to impose some boundaries, right? And that, in my hypothesis, is what kind of creates this turn to spin, right? I can only say this. How do I make this something into something, a message that such that people will still vote for me? Hey, could you figure out, like, if you pull it this way or that way, which way of phrasing it, right, is gonna trigger a voter, right, casting a ballot for me. So it should stand to reason, right, that if there's a turn away from this way of thinking about the market as something that sets boundaries on what politicians can do, which is driven, like right now, I think this is happening. It's completely driven by crisis, right? It's like the first years of the FDR, of the New Deal administration, just like throwing every solution at every possible problem it can and seeing what sticks, right? It's not ideologically guided. It's just they're confronting a whole range of really immediate problems, and if they're going to address them, then they have to be willing to spend some money. And I think that's kind of happening now. I don't think there's sort of a new ideology, but I think the sort of logic of the market is clearly not, doesn't have the hold, right? It once did. And so it should stand to reason then that you get politicians who can respond, who will respond, who don't need to spin their messages. The other thing I would say is that my sense, I've done a little bit of sort of almost like preliminary field work in certain sort of progressive political events and things. My sense is that one of the sort of elements that you get in some of, especially sort of the sort of younger generation networks in the political world, at least on the sort of democratic progressive side, is a real skepticism of consultants, right? A very open sort of critical perspective, right, on consultancies. both as a sort of a professional avenue that's open to them, but they don't want to pursue because they see it as sort of being bought out or sold out.
Yeah.
And as a problem in the way that political scientists and other social scientists have characterized it, as a problem of sort of impediment to meaningful representative politics. So it's a very long answer, but the short summary is, I think, both if my hypothesis is correct, and if my understanding kind of what's happening inside at least some political networks inside and outside the Beltway, I think there is potentially a sort of move away from and a sort of self-conscious avoidance, right, of the kind of politics of spin that has dominated the American politics since the 90s.
Right. Okay. I get so the economic dimension of politics is clearly the most salient and has been in the post-war period. But what about the rise of culture, values? There's an argument in political science that because of convergence on neoliberal policy, parties have actually amplified the distinctions that they make when it comes to values orientations. So this has to do with the politics of inclusion and belonging, the politics of identity and recognition, things like LGBTQ rights that might be more indivisible as political goods. So you take a stand on a topic rather than being able to negotiate or compromise the way you might be able to on questions of redistribution or something like that. Do you find that there is the same kind of spin used for non-economic policy issues, or do you find that because they are different in the way that they can be sort of characterized, in that they can be sometimes much more binary or dichotomous, that there's not as much need to sell policies around those?
Right. So if I understand the question, it's how do I sort of evaluate this argument in political science that, to the extent there's sort of consensus on economic questions, they turn more to questions sort of identity, is right, that, and culture.
Yeah.
Right. I guess, as is so often a case, I both kind of agree and disagree with that way of characterizing things. So, for instance, the characterization of movements on the basis of race, right, or contemporary anti-racist movements, the characterization of that as identity politics, as opposed, it sort of strikes me as a bit of a mischaracterization. And this comes from a perspective that sort of historical sociological perspective that race is a structure, right? That race is a long-standing American institution that has organized American politics and many other things for a long time. And so one of the things that you see, at least in the Clinton years, is this sort of is not so much a turn to those kinds of, if you characterize as identity politics, it's not so much a turn to that, at least on questions of sort of race, but rather sort of burying of those concerns.
Yeah.
Right. That was pretty well expressed in the rift between the New Democrats and the DLC and Jesse Jackson and the Rainbow Coalition. Right. So I guess what I'm saying is I'm not sure I really agree with the characterization of non-economic questions as therefore sort of identity questions, and what I see at least on the Democratic side in the 90s is actually a suppression, right, of what are sometimes characterized as identity questions, especially around questions of race and racial equality. And then there is a turn, I guess, you can see this as sort of more cultural, like debates over things like, school prayer and and things like that. Then so I guess I'm kind of talking because I'm not sure how to answer the question. I guess I just don't see, I guess what I'm saying is I don't think there's such a clear relationship between a sort of economic consensus and a turn to identity or cultural issues.
Okay.
And I think there's sometimes an underestimation of the extent to which you can see this even in the Carter years, with his famous malaise speech, the one informed by the pollster and strategist Pat Cadell, where it's actually a sort of internal decision to pivot away from economic questions in the context of an inflationary crisis and start talking about culture and identity that's actually driven by expert interpretations, right, of external events inside party networks. So I see that as not necessarily a broad rule, right, that the more you have economic consensus, you turn to identity questions. I see it again as a sort of product of contestation internal to party networks, where there's even a politics over what gets categorized as economic or structural, right, or systemic versus something that's identity or cultural, and you know, by extension, often characterizes things that kind of aren't amenable to policy solutions.
Right, right. I completely agree on the question of whether or not race is identity, but so I guess that brings us to time, unfortunately, but thank you so much for this wonderful talk. We're really excited about the research that comes out of this project. Everything that you're showing here is super compelling, really interesting. And thank you to our audience for joining us today. Thanks so much, Professor.
Thanks very much. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, bye.